name is Jermaine Reese. I am the director for the Police and Corrections Academies here at Grand Rapids Community College. March is National Criminal Justice Month, and with all that has transpired in the previous year and those things that have gone on this year relative to the criminal justice profession, I felt it prudent to have a discussion on criminal justice reform. Tonight, I'm encouraged, and we have a dynamic panel, and I'm anticipating the discussion. We have with us Dr. Afeni McNeely Cobham. She is a native of East New York, Brooklyn, and has worked in higher education for 29 years as a faculty member, administrator, excuse me, and consultant. In the fall of 2018, she joined the Grand Rapids Community College as the inaugural Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer. In this role, Dr. McNeely Cobham works with students, faculty, staff, and community members to embed principles of diversity and social justice into the bedrock of the institution. An accomplished student affairs scholar practitioner, Dr. McNeely Cobham served in a myriad of roles in athletic Greek life, housing and residential life, career services, student activities, leadership development, academic advising, student conduct, Title IX, and enrollment management. Afeni earned her, bachelor's degree in communications from Marist College, and MED and student personnel in higher education from the University of Georgia, and her PhD in higher education administration from Indiana University. Most notable about her tenure at IU was making history as the first recipient of the Master of Arts degree in African American and Africana Diaspora Studies. Dr. McNeely Cobham, her research interests examine race, identity, culture in American education, identity development of student or college students, and the influence of hip hop culture and music and socio-political thought. Dr. MC, a moniker bestowed on her by students, is a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and the Order of Eastern Star. Dr. McNeely Cobham, we welcome you this evening.
Thank you for having me. We
also have as a guest Commissioner Joe Jones. Joe Jones is the founder of the Hakima group and a seasoned executive leader who is passionate, strategic-minded, and a servant leader with over 2 decades of experience leading teams and managing diverse organizations and individuals while using an equity lens in the public and private sectors. He is proficient both in financial and operational management. He is skilled at cultivating and enriching relationships. Jones has a proven record of leading, advising, walking alongside, communicating and collaborating across ethnic, geographic boundaries, and with corporate executives, philanthropy executives, opinion leaders, elected officials, nonprofit leaders, education leaders, grassroots, community leaders, residents, and media. Jones also serves as the Grand Rapids City Commissioner representing the 2nd Ward. He was first appointed in February of 2016 and later elected in August of 2017. Commissioner Jones serves on a number of boards. He is also an ordained minister and an assistant pastor at Brown Hutchinson Ministries. He holds a bachelor's degree in communication arts from Oakland University and was conferred a degree of master in ministry leadership at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. He also completed executive leadership training programs at Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, Stanford University Graduate School of Business, and the New York Stern School of Business. Joe and his wife, Jessie, are the proud parents of 4 children and grandparents of 5. Commissioner Jones, we welcome you tonight to this discussion as well.
Thank you very much for having me, brother. Appreciate it.
All right, let's get at it. Um, when we think about social justice as it relates to people of color, this topic of police reform or criminal justice reform, quite frankly, has always stayed at the forefront. However tragic, this is not a new phenomenon. So let's, as we look back over the year of 2020, before we even get into those discussions, how did we get here today regarding the extreme need for reform? And I'll let either one of you, whoever, Dr. MC, how did we get here?
One of the things I've been thinking about in terms of the how is from a historical context. The 13th Amendment comes to mind, right? So 89. Don't totally quote me on that. Historians could look it up later. But there's the 13th Amendment added to the Constitution. And part of it is talking about the institution of slavery in America. And I don't think you can have a conversation about a system that was built in America without looking at the dehumanization of people at the epicenter of that system. So the 13th Amendment says, people are free citizens. However, with not in the context of if they are convicted of a crime, then they have, the authorities have the full right to put them back into imprisonment in so many ways. I draw that connection to the fact that after the Civil War, to disenfranchise those enslaved people who were now emancipated, they came up with something called Black Codes. And Black Codes were designed to keep the institution of slavery in place from a legal canon, right? And using such things, I was looking this up maybe a couple of days ago, like labor contracts. If you decided modern day, let's use modern day terminology, to walk into your supervisor's office and resign, or you don't want to terminate your contract, that was actually considered illegal for Black people. And one could be prosecuted and thrown in jail or a labor camp under these Black Code laws. Other things around the land ownership, right? And if you own too much land in a particular section of a community, this was in South Carolina, they could literally prosecute you and send you, to imprison for too much land ownership. So although there was printed documents that talked about freedom and inalienable rights, these Black Codes certainly did not allow for that under the Southern legislature. And Black Codes were the precursor to Jim Crow laws, which lasted over 100 years. Under Jim Crow, you literally could go to jail for just standing in the middle of the street and being Black. So they had segregated theaters and public parks and public pools. And if anyone infringed on breaking that color line about where one could go in terms of being a Black person, they were incarcerated. So when you draw a connection to the 13th Amendment, and then the way laws were used to keep Black people at a certain social status, if you will, in America, there was never an opportunity for the quote unquote criminal justice system to not be brutally prejudiced and biased in some way. So I look at the totality of our criminal justice system and say that it was never a system developed with equity and fairness and justice in mind, but to keep things status quo would be the historical context for that.
Mr. Jones.
I'm so grateful that Dr. MC mentioned the 13th Amendment and in particular Black Codes. I actually had, as part of my notes, included Black Codes, pig laws, convict leasing, chain gangs. These were all manifestations of new criminal justice policies, and they were developed to really limit the ability of Black folk to engage in political, economic, and social agency. And so it really does speak to, I think, ultimately what I would call, I'm stealing from the title of Khalil Gibran Muhammad, which is the condemnation of Blackness. I think if I had to find a title for it, I would borrow his title. And I think that is what has been the case whether it was during slavery or at the end of slavery and during the time of Reconstruction, when clearly there was just this very clear effort, intentional effort to criminalize or to condemn Blackness, and along with it, it was, I think, a very concerted effort to again, utilize or to further engage in the opportunity to partake of free labor by way of Black bodies. And so, you know, and to Dr. MC's point, this was not these, you know, all of these things were considered crimes, and we look at it in, you know, through a lens of today. And many people would probably just shake their head. They couldn't believe that, you know, to be arrested to some extent for just being. And yet we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that manifest itself in today's society. But, you know, I myself, as I am working diligently, Dr. MC, to hopefully one day be recognized as a historian, I tell you what, I sometimes am like at a loss of words as I'm reading and I'm studying, and I'm just, in terms of what our people in particular had to endure, and the fact that we're still here it's just a testament to resilience, which is not something that necessarily that I don't think any people group would want to be known for. It's like, who wants to be known for resilience? It's great that we were been able to maintain, but who wants to be known for that, right? And yet it is what has kept us afloat. And, you know, when I think of, you know, the history of criminal justice and criminal justice reform, you know, there had to be, or the hope had to be, I think at that time, looking back at the 1800s, the hope of perhaps something or someone standing up and really beginning to fight for and really call for reform and just help for clear, you know, for a time that was clearly, you know, prejudicial and just wrong. And so, again, I am to this day, I'm still, I'll come across testimonies and stories and just am blown away by just the fact that we were able to overcome and live another day. So.
No, and those are very insightful, which it brings me to another point. There's a book that I picked up at a conference, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and the book is titled "The History of Policing in America," from militia or from slave patrols and militia. And so it recounts, or it is a recount, or a historical recap, I should say, of the evolution of policing in America. And it's interesting because that's, I think, one of the things when we think about, or when we talk about or have the discussion about any type of reform, we can't do it outside of the context of the historical implications that lie, especially with these social institutions. Some of that reading led me to Derek Bell and his critical race theory. And in the past, I want to keep I don't necessarily keep it politically free, but with the critical race theory came under fire under the last presidential administration. And I think it was largely due to misinformation. So, and Derek Bell, in that critical race theory, challenged the Brown v. Education decision, citing that we have to look at the systemic racism and systemic practice or racist practices that are, as you mentioned, when we go back to the 13th Amendment, all of these things were written and put into place to govern our society prior to emancipation. So now we have these institutions that were formed, and now they have these implications. So, and I say that to ask this next question: how important is it for us to examine the historically systemic racist or racism and its implication that it has in a system like the criminal justice system? Because when you both mentioned going back to the slave codes, Policing got its start as slave patrols. I mean, those individuals that they would be sent out to prior to emancipation, catch individuals who had escaped their plantations. And so I think that's something that we as law enforcement don't like to bring up. It's like that ugly family secret, much like the conversation of slavery in America when we talk about reparations and when we talk about the reckoning for, people of color. It's always we have to have this conversation absent slavery. That was so long ago. But so how important is it that we view reform in a context that takes into consideration the historical implication and racist practices?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that question. I'm gonna offer my response, but before I do, class, if you could you type in the Q&A box something like resources, because I have some links that I want to share with our audience, and I won't be able to do it from my end. So I'll share those links following class's question. What it has in there is the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay that played on Netflix. It's actually on YouTube for free now, and a few other things. Dr. Reese, I wanted to bring us back to January 27th when we, GRCC hosted Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. He says something that stayed with me, and it's appropriate to your question, and I'm quoting him. He says, every word that ends in system is a part of systemic racism. Public health system, he said, critical criminal justice system, higher education system, prison system. Whenever the word ends in system, you know the potential to perpetuate inequity exists. And so I raised that quote in response to say that if we are in fact, the audience and Commissioner Jones and those of us who are speaking, and yourself, Dr. Reese, committed to this idea of reform really taking shape, we can't afford not to spend important critical time on the historical context and how these systems came to be. To negate that or relegate it as I wasn't alive, I shouldn't have to pay for what people did 400 years ago is, if you would, my nicest way to say it, a half-baked idea that somehow we can get to the problem jumping to the now, 2020, 2021, and not dealing with 1700s, right? Early 20th century, and how those things never changed, but in fact evolved and became more sophisticated. There's some modern day and current practices that are happening. I mentioned earlier in my comments about Black codes and Jim Crow laws, and Black people being prosecuted for just being. So fast forward to 2021, there's a snowstorm in Texas, and there's a young brother who's arrested for walking home in that snowstorm, right? I had to prove, hey, all I'm doing is trying to get home. The video I shared with you earlier, right? A 5-year-old in school. It's a behavioral issue, supposedly, but police officers coming to put him in handcuffs, 5 years old. So nothing has changed much about the way in which we look at Black bodies, and I would dare to say people of color in general, and see the most deviant or criminalized perspective first before moving to this idea of how do we go about helping them. So it would behoove anyone who's remotely committed to the idea of reform to spend time with history. History is going to tell us what we shouldn't do or what we shouldn't repeat.
I tell you what, the idea of more people committing to being students, I think is essentially what this comes down to. And it's, as mentioned, I'm working diligently, not working hard enough because there's only 24 hours in a day. But the idea, the one element, the one thing in life that actually allows me to do the work that I do is the fact that as frustrating as things can get, as difficult as things are right now, what brings me peace is I understand how we got there. And there's something to be said about history playing that role of literally helping you better understand how we got to where we are. Good, bad, or indifferent, it happened. And it is quite often, it is full of facts that help us understand why things are the way they are. And this is a true story. If I receive $5 for every time some folk in community, and in particular, my white brothers and sisters in Grand Rapids have asked me over the 25 years that I've been here, hey, Joe, how do we fix, whether it's chronic unemployment, whether it's fatherlessness, whether it's health disparities, you name it. If I got $5 for every time someone asks me, hey, Joe, how do we fix, and you fill in the blank, I'd be a rich man right now. And I say, and my response, what I've done is I've canned the response. And the response is, before we can talk about how to fix it, we first have to understand how we got here. Because it's literally impossible to really, to actually have any confidence at all in thinking that we can fix a problem or seriously engage in trying to repair a problem if we don't fully understand how we got here. Because there's a tendency to keep on bumping our heads and making the same mistakes and not really getting anywhere. But the moment that we commit ourselves to, again, becoming students and understanding the power of history, the better. Because again, and to your point, Dr. MC, the history, look, history is ugly. History is, it's the kind of thing where I can guarantee you, if you are of a certain background, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be very uncomfortable. And there's going to be a lot of perhaps guilting and shaming that comes with it. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. And I live by the creed that you don't know what you don't know. But the moment you find out, okay, if you don't make the decision to try to change the outcomes of some things that you know of, then you stand the chance of being seen as complicit. And I think a lot of times that's the case, is a lot of folks don't really want to find out, because they know that when they find out, the expectation is, hey man, either I got to be a part of changing this thing, or if I don't, what does that say about me? But that's the beauty of history, in my opinion. One of the beautiful elements of history.
Thank you. And you both, and listening to both of your responses, it made me think back to imaging, or the just the thought of messaging and imaging. And when we talk about systemic practices, I want to ask, because it took me back to post-emancipation. When you talk about the movie, The Birth of a Nation, and how the characterization of people of color was it was horrible. And so when you think about that, and when you think about the imaging and messaging, my question is, how impactful are these false narratives about Black and brown people and their continued marginalization when they encounter the criminal justice system? Commissioner Jones.
I am my previous work experience, or my previous role prior to the Urban League, was I was in public relations for about 14 years. And so I know just a little bit about media, and in particular, really the power of or the impact of media narratives, and in particular, how we as Black folk are seen, or how we are positioned in media. And I think that we are so far away, unfortunately, from getting to a better place in terms of the characterization of Black people, of brown people. And quite often, I think that the media are the ones who actually get a break. They aren't, in my opinion, held to a higher standard. It's really just the one-offs where we have some instances where it's so brazen, it's so obvious that you have to call attention to it. But the reality is that it's happening in newsrooms every single day, whether it be local news or even national news. And I think that until we are, more intentional about really holding media to a higher level of accountability, I think we're going to keep on getting the same types of images that we get. And it's just very, very disheartening. It's something that if you are, again, trying to raise children in this day, you know, what does that say to a child? I often say one of the benefits, again, I've been here for 25 years. I moved here from the D. And one of the benefits of growing up in the D that I had was that every bit of success that I saw looked like me. And so my image, the image that I saw of Blackness was very, very positive because it was all around me. And so I was in many ways kind of prepared as I was growing up to be able to, you know, to discern that which was right and that which was wrong in terms of imagery. But I think in today's society, in particular, if you don't live in one of those in one of those environments, what does that say about us trying to teach our children and our grandchildren about the imagery, right? And how they see themselves? Because ultimately, it comes down to that, in my opinion, is this idea of how do you see yourself, right? And if the last thing that I want is for our children and grandchildren to be to be described or to have their imagery developed by someone who doesn't look like them. And so I think, again, we're very much in a danger zone, especially as it pertains to media. Again, I don't think much has changed at all.
Dr. MC.
There was a study by two scholars out of Harvard, if that means anything to some people, that 93% of the Black Lives Matter protest was nonviolent. No uproar, no cars burnt, no buildings burnt, that sort of thing. No altercations with police officers, 93%. But if you watch the three major cable news networks, you wouldn't be able to tell that, which then feeds the social media narrative of people wanting to conflate the insurrection of January 6th as the same with the Black Lives Matter movement or other social protest movements, right? Pipelines with our indigenous brothers and sisters and others. That means something when producers in the media feel compelled to only show when there's smoke and fire, as opposed to people who are organized, articulate, and used civil rights tactics, right, from the 60s and 70s to make their argument, right, about wanting civil rights and civil liberties, but in fact not being violent to have that happen. So that's important. The other thing I would add to that, I was a radio, TV, film major in undergrad. So that's some 30 years ago, far removed from that. Wanted to be Oprah, that didn't quite work out. We started to talk a lot about how pop culture influences the way that people think. So when I was thinking about that question, and I just ran real quick to Google something to be fully transparent. Think about some of the TV shows that have desensitized us to the way that the criminal justice system does things wrong. The First 48. When I started watching the show very early in its infancy, they were showing how they would bring people in on a hunch or a suspicion, no real evidence. And they had 48 hours to ask them questions without legal representation. And if they didn't, catch them in this web, well, then they had to let them go. And I literally had to check myself because I started feeling sorry for terrible policing practices, right? Oh no, they gotta capture this person in 48 hours or the case is out the window. When in fact, that's not how you're supposed to do it. It's supposed to have representation, credible, reasons for even bringing somebody in to question them, so forth and so on. You think about Cops and how long that ran, right? On the Fox network, bad boys, what you gonna do? Pop culture, teaching us right away that whoever we see on camera has to be a bad person and therefore deserving of being tackled full throttle or a knee on their neck to arrest them or being, verbally dehumanized. The movie, right, then adds on to that with Will Smith and Martin Lawrence and a host of other ways in which we have used policing shows or criminal justice shows to desensitize us to things that are happening wrong in our system. So it was pretty powerful when I started to think about that I've fallen prey to it. And I'm sure certainly others, that pop culture has also played a role in how the criminal justice system is, that we are led to believe that this is the way that you're supposed to go about it.
And that brings up another interesting point, especially one of your comments in your response about the knee on the neck. May 25th, 2020. I don't think that there's anyone alive who hasn't seen or watched or heard of the video, the killing of George Floyd. And I remember our town hall discussion that we had right after that. And I just want to phrase the question because in 18 years of law enforcement that I spent in the city of Flint, not to preach or sit on the soapbox and say that I was by any means perfect, because I was not. I changed and I grew and learned a lot through that process. But this hit different. When we saw that event, that horrific event play out, over and over again, what is it about the recent killings? And that George Floyd was just one of many. What's different about this or the recent killings of unarmed African-American men and women that have sparked or reinvigorated this sense of urgency when we talk about reform? Dr. MC.
Oh, me first? I was going to yield to the commissioner.
Or either one.
I'll start because he hasn't unmuted yet. And I was just trying to send another resource that I put under somebody else's question regarding the study I mentioned. So from an equity lens, as a chief equity officer on a college campus, George Floyd's case specifically is a tipping point in the criminal justice system. And I believe it evolved to that, or it's centered on being a tipping point, because we, as a whole, here in America, we started talking about equity on several fronts: socio-political equity, economic equity, health equity or health disparities when it came to the pandemic. And then George Floyd happening was the tipping point related to equity or injustice or the lack thereof. So you had several factors around inequities kind of going around the orbit, if you would. And everyone was able to converge and come, well, I shouldn't say everyone. There were more people who came into a consciousness around inequity when George Floyd happened. Having the time to watch it, right? Being home, being more aware and attentive. Social media certainly helped with that. And then already hearing over and over again, and particularly in our news cycle, about the inequities that one faces on these many different levels. And so from a criminal justice standpoint, that was one of them. For our viewership, George Floyd has happened so many times before. I think about Rodney King when I was a college student, right? And just in a synopsis, this person allegedly speeding. And when he's pulled over to be apprehended, you have several officers who nearly tried to end that man's life on an LA highway. He happened to survive, right? And it was caught on video footage. And the rest of the story goes, you can Google it as to what happened, but it certainly led to social unrest. Let me say justifiable social unrest in the streets of LA. So George Floyd wasn't the first time. I was not surprised by what happened. I was just hurt to have to watch, to be traumatized over and over again about how that played out. And I don't plan to watch much of the trial case because they're already showing footage of that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, noting that Mr. Floyd said, "I can't breathe" 27 times. There's a lot of Black men and women who've said that phrase, "I can't breathe." So it wasn't the first time. And unfortunately, Google some of the cases that happened after George Floyd, 2 or 3 months after that. And so it's not an anomaly for people of color to be under the heavy hand of policing, and subsequently murdered. And I think in this case, it happened at a point where everybody was watching in a way and unnerved by that. If you weren't paying attention before, you had no choice in the case of George Floyd.
Dr. MC brings up a point that I think as we look back, 10, 15 years from now, during the year of 2020, and of course the biggest story being the pandemic. Part of the pandemic part of what it did was it kept us at home, right? So this whole idea of this stay-at-home order. And I want to suggest that in times past, to your point, Dr. MC, we've seen the George Floyd's unfortunately deaths in the past. We've seen that movie before. But the fact that people, in many ways, I think what made it different was people were forced to watch it. And more people were forced to watch it because we didn't have anything else to do. Like literally the vast majority of America had to stay at home. And so when it came to pass, everybody, and it kind of reminded me of to this day I still I compare it to some degree to the death of Emmett Till or the funeral of Emmett Till, where
Right.
Emmett Till's casket on the front of Jet magazine. And not just that, but the mother made it the point she wanted the open casket funeral for the world to see. And that's when you had this blip in the screen and there was, a concerted effort put forward to address what had happened to the type of crime that had happened to Emmett Till. And I think, again, what differentiates the George Floyds of the world is this moment in time when you had a significant amount of people at home who were either watching TV or had one, were really positioned to watch television. And there was no real question because that thing was so crystal clear. This wasn't from the perspective of a body cam. This was someone who literally filmed the death of this man. And as the youngest of 9 children, I will tell you, first of all, I only watched it one time. Okay, as a Black man, one time. And I will tell you, the thing that to this day that still gets to me is this grown man calling on his mama. Okay, as a baby boy of my family, 5 boys and 4 girls, I've called on mama countless times. But the fact that he was calling on his mother, who was no longer alive, right? Or that imagery, that is being part of his last words, right? His final words. Here we are in this, for those who practice the Christian faith, we're in Holy Week, right? We got a lot of churches doing what's called the 7 last words. And so you've got these, and so I'm thinking about the last words of this man, right? And part of that being calling on his mama. It just really, I think, again, it speaks to this time in history, which I'm so hopeful that we will have real reform, real change. And I am one to call George Floyd a martyr, because George Floyd did not ask to die. He was not trying to die. His death, his life and death means something, means so much more. And my goal is to make sure that I do all that I can and be a part of things that will not make his death be in vain.
I had another question, but both of your statements shifted my direction, and I'll come back around to the question I was going to ask you. But I just want to pick back up off of how you ended, and I'll let Dr. MC, if you don't mind leading off of this. But you stated real reform. What does real reform look like in light of what we've talked about so far? The historical context, the false narratives, and when we talk about systemic practices,
Mm-hmm.
what does real reform look like?
So, strangely enough, I'm going to quote a Republican. And if you didn't know my political ideology before, you do now, which is why I preface it with strangely enough. Adam, help me with it. Kinzinger, Kinzinger. He's out of Illinois. And I'm watching him on the news cycle, and he says something pretty profound, or that stayed with me. And he said, lawmakers cannot be so afraid of losing their job that they don't do the right thing. We need more lawmakers in Congress and Senate and at the state level. Hello, my state friends in Michigan, to have that same disposition. I am less consumed with not being reelected in an effort to do the right thing. And do the right thing is such a simplistic way to say reform centuries of a system that never started out right. It never put several groups of people in position to be represented fairly and to be treated fairly or to be treated humane, to go beyond that. So I think for our lawmakers, local, state, federal, there has to be this idea that they're not so consumed with reelection or keeping their job. Mayors and sheriffs too, right? Not so consumed with keeping their job that they're not willing to be the bravest, in this time period to really make these changes. The other part of this idea of reform is we talked about this earlier, being able to dig deep into the history to say, how do we get here? And then is there a way to dismantle it, or do we need to overhaul it altogether? And what does that look like in the 21st century to be a part of a criminal justice system that in fact serves all, where there is ethical behavior, where people are held accountable when they don't do right? And is there an opportunity for reconciliation and to give someone a second chance if that opportunity presents itself? Not every opportunity does, but I also believe in offering that so that people who do make mistakes knows that there's a clear path to being able to try to recover from it. So that would be my take.
I tend to believe that part of the strategy to get to reform is somehow finding a way to show the financial benefit that comes with reform. We live in a country that is, again, it's a capitalist regime, so to speak, and so I think of an individual. You mentioned Kissinger, Dr. MC, and I think of the Koch brothers. Okay, so hear me now. The Koch brothers have historically been about they've been about that money, right? They have amassed significant wealth. They buy companies all the time. We use a lot of products that if folks aren't, I don't think folks are fully aware of just how wide and how deep they go in terms of what they own. And a lot of the products that we use are owned by companies that are owned by Koch, the Koch Industries. But it was about maybe 7 years ago when the Koch brothers stepped up and they began to push for prison reform. Now, I want to suggest that maybe, just maybe, they were doing it because something pressed their heart, or maybe they heard from the Lord and they felt the need to really pivot and go in a different direction. But I also want to suggest that part of the dynamic was, at the end of the day, when you're in business, especially when it comes to manufacturing, you need bodies. You need individuals who can perform the task in order to allow you to sell the product that you're manufacturing. And without it, it's really hard to be in business. And you can only send so much to China. You can only send so much to Mexico. Quite often, you got to find a way to get it done here. And so I think part of reform is really a framing that speaks to, if it makes dollars, you can make it make sense, right? And so you have this belief that, okay, in prison you have these able-bodied individuals who my father-in-law would say. My father-in-law is from Louisiana. He would refer to someone as either having work in them or not having work in them, right? I want to suggest that we got a lot of folk, whether incarcerated or just in general in our society, they got a lot of work in them, right? If you 20 something, you got about 30 plus years of work in you. And so what that population represents, I think, for the business community, the prison population is a workforce. Individuals who've got some work in them, who could really help their businesses thrive. And so I think part of reform, if we're developing strategy around reform, is how can I, develop this thing in a way in which perhaps non-traditional folk who you wouldn't think of would be involved in reform would come to the table with not just resources, but with a willingness to want to engage because it's going to somehow benefit them. Now, they may not ever state it, they may not want it known, but again, if it gets us to the place that we're trying to get to, then it's something that I want to be supportive of. But I think that quite often when it comes to reform, there has to be, I think, again, a strategic lens that's being applied, and it's not always the most obvious. It really does require sometimes, again, what I would call unusual suspects.
The other part about that, Commish, is it has to be, if we're looking at capitalism-centered reform, there has to be a human rights element to that. So I think about the idea of people with work in them who, when they are released, also need to have their voting rights restored and to work in an environment that is safe, that has a living wage attached to it, health insurance, health coverage, right? And a host of other things that oftentimes Koch Brothers, Bezos, and a host of others don't want to give into. So that'll be interesting as well.
I couldn't agree more. I think that that's, I think without that, it's just, we're kind of going around in circles, right? We're just playing a game. We're just kind of, doing the same thing, but calling it something different. And to your point, I look at, and I raise the example of Coke simply because, again, when it happened, when I saw it, I had to step back for a second and really discern. Now there has to be another reason. Again, they've never come out and said it, but in my opinion, it has to be because ultimately, there's a need for human resources, right? Human capital. And what is not on the top of their list, or what they don't necessarily have a reputation for, is having companies that pay a living wage or provide health benefits or is seen as a safe environment, right? And so you're right. There is a critical need for, again, very strategic efforts to bring about reform. I think for some people, if they can get reform, that's great. But at the end of the day, are we really considering the potential unintended consequences that come with reform?
So, and those are excellent points. And there's a couple of good things, Michelle Alexander and her book, The New Jim Crow, mass incarceration and the age of colorblindness, it came to mind. And I'll tell you, for the audience, if you've never read that book, you need to purchase it. It will, as a practitioner, when I came across that book, it opened my eyes to a lot of the issues of disparity when you're talking about sentencing guidelines and things of that nature. And when you're talking about working 18 years in that system, not necessarily the prison system, but and a part of that, it kind of spoke to that. And I think when we talk about capitalism, there's a real thin line where we talk about it has to be that ethics or component or a human rights component, because that was one of the problems with the early prison system when you talk about prison inmate leasing. And so that was something to where when we talk about the cyclical effect, we are one of the only countries that have, when we think about secondary punishments or invisible punishments for people, incarcerated individuals. And so if a person was sentenced to 10 years and they do their whole 10-year sentence, they come out and life doesn't change. As a matter of fact, I think in most cases, it can be worse in some regards, because now, and I think this is one of the things with the Remove the Box initiative would have been a step in the right direction. I don't think it would have mitigated the problem, because again, when you're labeled, we don't forgive. I mean, we talk about forgiveness, but individuals who have, by the standards of the Constitution and all the laws that govern our society, they have paid their debt to society, but yet once we expect them to reintegrate into society, we have all these barriers that are in place. And so two terms came to, well, one term, but material determinism and entrance conversion. And so that's one of the tenets of that critical race theory when we're talking about reform, is because the elite and those that are in a position of privilege and power benefit. And so how do we shape, or how do we, when you talk about capitalism, because with true capitalism, I mean, we've got what we view capitalism as, and then you've got that 1% who they have a completely different idea of what true capitalism is. So how do we shift the pendulum to where it's, like you said, in a situation where we can use or, teach these individual skills? Because when you think about it, it costs $30,000 a year to incarcerate one individual, and the price has probably gone up exponentially. So $30,000, you think about that, that's the cost of a college education or a trade degree in some cases. And so when you're talking about workforce, how about instead of, you're talking about a 10-year sentence for one person, so that's $300,000 that you've paid for this individual to remain stagnant, not to give that person skills. And then we say, okay, now you've paid your debt. And so how do we shift or make that pendulum swing to the point where we help individuals that are empowered to understand that concept that you just brought out? Commissioner, when you're talking about the utilizing those resources, how do we make that shift or that swing?
I think we're right now we're in a place, and again I point back to the murder of George Floyd. I was with a colleague today, and we were talking about really small business development opportunities for Black entrepreneurs, and we both agree. We talked about this window of opportunity that's open right now, and the absolute need to be, I use the words, there's a need right now to be both intentional and unapologetic with regards to having a commitment to equity, inclusion, but really doing all that we can to, do we ever get to a place where the gap is, to where there is no gap? I don't think so. I often joke, I don't think that happens. I don't think racism ends or the gap totally closes until Jesus returns. Again, that's based on one's religious background, and there's more explaining to do. But I would say that these are things that I've come to believe that, I'm gonna, as long as I'm living, they're gonna be present. And so to answer your question, I think that now more than ever, there is a need to just be just overly intentional and unapologetic in an effort to try to address some historic inequities and do it in a way that it may not always result in having buy-in across the board, but we have to continue. This is where I think history comes in. We have to continue to tell the story. We have to continue to develop, or provide the other narrative, right? Because all we have access to, for the most part, would be the master narrative. But as we know, there's more to the story, and so there's a critical need to be able to provide additional narrative, to continuously work in creating a narrative that speaks to the power of possibility and the power of what can be. Because when I look at our country, that's one of the things that I think our country likes to hang its hat on, is all that we can be. And so it's like, how do we connect with, with the more national belief or value, but at the same time, make it something that is, again, both intentional and unapologetic in terms of trying to close that gap. And in particular, I think reform is at the top of the list of really trying to position it where people can have access to a better life. I have a firm belief that all I want to see is I want to see more folk who have been historically marginalized get a bite at the apple, to be able to experience something like economic prosperity. Now, whether or not they choose to take the bite, that's on the individual. But we need to have more and more plethora of opportunities to take that bite, and that only comes with being intentional and being unapologetic, in my opinion.
So we have a few more minutes left, and I want to. There are a couple questions that we have from the audience. One is, so what are next steps in criminal justice reform? It was a two-part question. And what can we do now to bring more to the table other than what is expected from us going into law enforcement opportunities? So the first part is what's next, and then what can we do to bring more to the table?
In terms of what is next, I think there are organizations like the Equal Justice Institute that are working diligently they've developed a strategy, an agenda, and they are again using the court system and legislation to try to bring about change. But as we all know, there's the benefit of people power. So I think that whether it's on a national front or even on the local front, I think what's next needs to be really a commitment from individuals to get behind efforts that are clearly indicate authentic reform and that can bring about substantive change, in our communities, in particular for communities who have been historically marginalized. I also believe that when it comes to just again, the work of reform, I often say that there are two jobs these days that are probably the most difficult in our country. One would be that of a teacher. The other would be that of a police officer. And I wish I had the answer in terms of how to make things easier. But I think part of it is what you all do at GRCC, Dr. Reese, and that is I have laid my eyes on a number of programs, criminal justice programs, in particular police academies throughout the country. That's part of my responsibility as a commissioner. And I want to suggest, and I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting on GRCC time, but I want to suggest that what you all are doing there has the potential to make a significant impact on law enforcement, simply because of what you are availing these students to in terms of the realities of where they're going to serve. And I think that is part and parcel. What's also important about reform is, those who are involved in the work have a responsibility as well. And so, you have individuals who are going into the profession, and just think if they were in a position where they are beginning to learn, to either unlearn or relearn, and begin to police in a way, or engage in policing in a way that will add to the efforts to bring about police reform, not just kind of going into it, doing the same thing, thinking the same way. And so again, I applaud CC for the efforts. And if it were up to me, we would get all of our police officers from GRCC, but I don't make those decisions. I just make recommendations. So
I appreciate that. Dr. MC, did you want to add to that? Because I want to respect both of your times. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule. So
what I'll just say quickly is that now President Biden, when it was clear that he was elected as president, he stood up on the podium and he said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, Black people, you have stood by me, and now I will stand by you. I want to hold him accountable and make good on that promise as someone who is in leadership to put the right people in place at the federal and state level who will use a framework of social justice, not just diversity, equity, and inclusion, but social justice to make really substantive reform policies and practices. That's going to be important. If it happens at that level, that's the one thing that can trickle down, not economics, but in fact, people in leadership saying, this is how we're going to reform the systems that we're in. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, do you, either of you have time for one more question from the audience? Okay. And so the question came up about, well, there are two, and I'll put those out, and one of you, Councilman or Commissioner Jones, if you can, there's a question about the defund the police or qualified immunity, and I'll just put both out. So one was, should we as a state, so Michigan or even Grand Rapids, since we're here, should we be looking to follow suit? The question was, should we push to get rid of qualified immunity at the state or nationwide level? I believe they said Illinois and Chicago, or Illinois and New York are both moving in that direction. So is moving away from qualified immunity, is that something that we should be looking at as a government institution?
If I could, I'll jump in and say that the answer to that is, I responded online there, that qualified immunity is something that is, or the eradication of it is something that has to occur at the state level. When New York City recently did it, I said, wow, New York City is a state within a state, because for them to be able to pull that off, that again, that speaks to their size and their scope. In Grand Rapids or in the state of Michigan, cities can't make that call. It has to be done at the state level. And I think one of the probably the greatest need these days around reform is around arbitration when it comes to policing. And again, that's at the state level. But right now, as things are written, as the law stands, it just makes it really difficult, I think, to get to a better place in terms of real reform or that aspect of reform from law enforcement, because there's only so much that we can do locally. And I think most people who are reaching out to the city commission in Grand Rapids in particular aren't fully aware of our limited capacity in terms of changing a lot of what goes on with law enforcement. That is quite often, again, at the state level and above. What we can do is very, very limited, unfortunately.
Thank you. Dr. MC, I'm going to pose this last, and this will be our last question. In light of the decriminalization of marijuana, and the question is, do you think the war on drugs played, or what do you think, or how do you think the war on drugs played in the current state of mass incarceration in the United States? And should we be looking at reversing sentences in light of the decriminalization of marijuana?
Yeah, I'll answer that in two ways. So another great documentary on Netflix, simply titled Crack. It chronicles how the quote unquote war on drugs only was centered on certain communities. So that's the first part. If you enjoy documentaries, please watch Crack on Netflix. And in terms of the decriminalization of marijuana, isn't that ironic? You send Black and brown bodies to prison, in some cases federal prison, for selling marijuana. And, some odd years later, because it's big business, to Commissioner Jones's point around money, right? Now you have people who could make $1 billion off of this, and it's not a criminal activity. So I believe retroactively, those sentences should be commuted. And at the same time, those students who were denied the opportunity to financial aid access, right, because they had a federal conviction, should be allowed to apply to financial aid and therefore attend college and not have it be a financial burden to them.
All right.
Brother Reese, there's not enough time in the evening, and you would require a whole nother panel discussion for me to talk to you about this whole marijuana game, brother. Trust me, as someone who sat through developing a policy for legal or for marijuana retail, or for both medical and for recreational use in Grand Rapids, let's just say that the whole thing is fixed in such a way to where it's very little opportunity for folks who look like us to be able to profit from marijuana because of the absolute need for a significant amount of cash or access to cash. And again, it's just, it's very disconcerting. It's actually rather, it's depressing if you let it depress you, because to your point, Dr. MC, we're talking about something that was an absolute albatross around us for decades. And now it is legal and folk are making a ton. Okay, not just small money. They're making lots and lots of money off something that we were historically arrested and charged and spent years and years in jail for. Yeah, that's a whole nother panel discussion. It is.
Well, I am grateful. I'm extremely grateful. Dr. MC, it is always a pleasure to be in your presence, your knowledge and wisdom. Commissioner Jones, likewise, I appreciate you both taking time out. To the viewers and the audience, I'm hoping that you nuggets were dropped that you can use and take back. I will encourage you, tomorrow we have a second night. We will have as our guest Chief Eric Payne from the Grand Rapids Police Department, as well as Sheriff Michelle LaJoy Young from the Kent County Sheriff's Department. And our conversation, or our topic of conversation tomorrow will center on providing services in an era of reform. So please join us again tomorrow night at the same time, 5 o'clock, and be well, everyone.